Opportunity webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to give a few housekeeping notes on today's Zoom webinar. This session is being recorded. The recording will be posted on the FEMA.gov webinar page in the coming days. All participants are currently on mute to minimize background noise, and cameras are turned off for this webinar format. Please use the Q&A feature to submit questions at any time during the webinar. We have a team of subject matter experts reviewing and preparing answers in the background, and we'll provide answers to as many questions as possible at the end of the session. To turn on the closed captioning in Zoom, click the CC button at the bottom of your screen. If you experience any technical issues, try refreshing your browser or rejoining the session. You can also use the Q&A pod at the bottom of the screen for additional assistance. At the end of the session, you'll see a brief survey pop up. We'd really appreciate your feedback to help improve future webinars. At this time, I'd like to introduce Joel Doolin, Deputy Assistant Administrator of the Hazard Mitigation Directorate, who will be taking us through the opening remarks. Joel?
Thank you, Ms. Millen, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar for the fiscal year 2026 Flood Mitigation Assistance Swift Current Notice of Funding Opportunity. We are greatly appreciative that over 400 of you are registered to join us this afternoon. Flooding remains one of the most frequent and costly hazards facing communities across our country. Our Flood Mitigation Assistance Swift Current program focuses on helping eligible applicants move quickly after flood-related disaster events to reduce or eliminate future flood damage to National Flood Insurance Program structures and save lives. For fiscal year 2026, Swift Current will be making available $600 million to support eligible flood mitigation activities. These activities include projects such as structure elevations, land acquisitions, mitigation reconstruction, and other eligible actions that can help reduce repetitive flood losses. Today's webinar, we will walk you through the program background and eligibility requirements, key funding details, application considerations, FEMA GO submission steps, common application issues, and available resources. We encourage both applicants and sub-applicants to use this information early, to coordinate closely with your state, tribal, or territorial and local partners, and prepare complete, well-documented applications for us to consider. Our goal this afternoon is to help our partners understand the opportunity presented in this NOFO, avoid common pitfalls in applying, and to help us move eligible projects forward as efficiently as possible. With that, I'll turn it over to the experts, Brandon Sweezy and the Flood Mitigation Assistance Team, to start your program overview. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you very much, Joel. Before we dive into the details of the fiscal year 2026 Flood Mitigation Assistance Swift Current funding opportunity, let's take a quick look at what's on our agenda today. We're going to start by providing an overview of some of the most important aspects that eligible applicants and sub-applicants need to know during the fiscal year 2026 grant cycle. These aspects include highlights of the Swift Current funding opportunity, its priorities, and how you can leverage its funding for flood mitigation projects and activities. Then we'll discuss some of the application process using FEMA Grants Outcomes, also known as FEMA GO, offering insights into successfully navigating the system. We will also provide information on the resources available to support your grant application and project implementation processes after the award has been obligated. Participants will have an opportunity to ask questions and closing remarks, and we'll wrap up our presentation for today. Our goal is to equip you with the knowledge and tools needed to make the most of this grant program and to enhance the resilience of your communities. Next, Christian Greenfield is going to provide an overview and more details about the fiscal year 2026 Swift Current funding opportunity. Over to you, Christian.
Thank you, Brandon. Before we get into the details of Swift Current, we'll lay the foundation with background on the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program. The Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Program is authorized by Section 1366 of the National Flood Insurance Act of 1968, as amended by the National Flood Insurance Reform Act of 1994, and further strengthened by the Biggert-Waters Flood Insurance Reform Act of 2012. The mission of the program is to reduce or eliminate the risk of repetitive flood damage to buildings insured under the National Flood Insurance Program, or NFIP, and within NFIP participating communities. Local communities, referred to as a sub-applicant, can apply through eligible applicants, which are states, federally recognized tribes, and U.S. territories. Sub-applicants should be in contact with the appropriate applicant agency, as there likely will be different deadlines for submittal and different formats for application submission. The Flood Mitigation Assistance Swift Current Program, from its inception in 2022, was designed to support the mutual objectives of reinforcing flood insurance and floodplain management policy. It accomplishes this by mitigating partially or completely high-risk repetitive or severe repetitive loss property or structures. The Flood Mitigation Assistance Program is funded under two appropriations: an annual appropriation of $175 million and $3.5 billion through 2026 from the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act. This is what we'll call the foundational pillars or goals for Swift Current. Flood mitigation assistance Swift Current was built with these four things in mind: speed of funding, flood mitigation, resilience, and the NFIP policyholder. Swift Current focuses on speed of funding to better align mitigation funds to the disaster survivors' recovery after flooding. This opportunity prioritizes mitigation of repetitively flooded and substantially damaged properties. Swift Current brings together federal, state, and local resources to increase resilience against future flood damage. Finally, Swift Current benefits the National Flood Insurance Program and its policyholders by seeking to reduce the number of repetitively flooded structures across the country. Now, I'll dive into the specifics for the fiscal year 2026 Flood Mitigation Assistance Swift Current funding opportunity. The Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Program makes federal funds available to states, U.S. territories, federally recognized tribal governments, and local governments to reduce or eliminate the risk of repetitive flood damage to structures insured under the National Flood Insurance Program, also known as the NFIP. Through the Swift Current funding, FEMA expedites flood mitigation assistance funding for flood mitigation projects after an emergency or major declared flood disaster, allowing communities to reduce risk more quickly. Prospective Swift Current applicants include all 50 states, U.S. territories, federally recognized tribal nations, and the District of Columbia. Sub-applicants can be local governments, tribal nations, state agencies, and tribal agencies. Local communities, sub-applicants, can apply through eligible applicants if they are participating and in good standing with the National Flood Insurance Program. Sub-applications are usually developed at the local level and submitted to the state. It is important to note that sub-applicants should check with their state agency to make sure they meet any earlier deadlines established. Sub-applicants cannot apply to FEMA directly. They need to submit their application to their state, territory, or tribal agency. That agency reviews the applications and sends them to FEMA. Sub-applicants should check with their agencies to make sure they meet the application deadlines. States may have already begun their notice of intent phase. Local communities should reach out to their state officials to find out more about the process their state will undertake as a result of these funding opportunities. For federally recognized tribes, you may be able to apply either as a direct applicant to FEMA or as a sub-applicant to a state. There are varying scenarios for both depending on tribal and state laws and your jurisdiction. Please reach out to your FEMA tribal liaison to discuss the options available to you. All applicants and sub-applicants must be participating in the National Flood Insurance Program, NFIP, and not be withdrawn, on probation, or suspended. Verify a community's current NFIP community status via the Community Status Book on FEMA.gov. As with all hazard mitigation assistance programs, FEMA requires applicants and sub-applicants to maintain FEMA-approved hazard mitigation plans both at the application deadline and when funding is obligated. The Flood Mitigation Assistance with Current program has additional requirements as funds are appropriated from National Flood Insurance Program policyholders, including sub-applicants must be active participants in the National Flood Insurance Program without probation or suspension, and all structures and project sub-applications must be insured by the National Flood Insurance Program throughout the mitigation process. For further details on eligibility, please refer to the Complete Fiscal Year 2026 Flood Mitigation Assistance with Current Funding Opportunity on grants.gov. Please note that it is extremely important for applicants and sub-applicants to verify their status using the Community Status Book on FEMA.gov and to consult with their state hazard mitigation officer. All applicants must have a FEMA-approved state or tribal standard or enhanced mitigation plan by the application deadline. When deciding which projects are best for your community or tribe, be sure to consult the 2025 Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program and Policy Guide. It's available at FEMA.gov. This resource outlines all eligible activities. The Flood Mitigation Assistance with Current Grant Program funds individual flood mitigation projects. To qualify, projects must reduce repetitive flood damage to NFIP-insured buildings, be cost-effective, align with your hazard mitigation plan, and meet environmental and historic preservation requirements. Now, a bit on benefit cost analysis, or BCA. FEMA requires all hazard mitigation projects to be cost-effective. FEMA generally assesses the cost-effectiveness of hazard mitigation projects through a benefit cost analysis, BCA. A quantitative analysis used to assess the cost-effectiveness of a hazard mitigation measure by comparing the project's avoided future damage benefits to the cost over the project lifetime. The result is a benefit cost ratio known as the BCR, which is the numerical expression of the cost effectiveness of a project calculated as the net present value of the total project's benefits divided by the net present value of total project cost. A project is generally considered to be cost effective when the BCR is 1.0 or greater. This indicates the benefits of a prospective hazard mitigation project are sufficient to justify the cost. In addition, the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program and Policy Guide available outlines a process for evaluating eligible mitigation projects that must be cost effective and have a total project cost less than 1 million through a cost effectiveness narrative. FEMA also recently published application support material that explains what information sub-applicants should include in a cost-effectiveness narrative for eligible projects with a total project cost of less than 1 million. Through the development of the BCA toolkit, FEMA created a standardized methodology that is specific to hazard mitigation activities and provides consistency across applicants and sub-applicants. Processes for cost effectiveness determination methods and standard values will be documented and made publicly available on FEMA's BCA webpage. Pre-calculated benefits are available for some project types, including acquisitions within the Special Flood Hazard Area, or SFHA, acquisitions of repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss properties located outside the SFHA, elevations in the SFHA and mitigation reconstructions in the SFHA. Using a pre-calculated benefit value does not change the eligibility requirement for developing a detailed cost estimate. A project's cost estimate must be based on industry standards, vendor or construction estimates, or other reliable and defensible sources. Pre-calculated benefits are available for some project types as shown on this slide. Additional information on demonstrating cost effectiveness may be found in the FY2026 Funding Opportunity, HMA Program, and Policy Guide and FEMA.gov. The National Flood Insurance Program, the NFIP, helps mitigate the impacts of flooding through flood risk maps, floodplain management standards, and flood insurance. NFIP data enables community planners, state officials, and supporting organizations to develop hazard mitigation plans, manage flood zone risk, apply for specific grants, and improve community and state resilience. FEMA offers publicly available NFIP data online. FEMA's new State, Tribal, and Territory STT Information Agreement expands and expedites data sharing between STTs and their partners. Once a state has signed an agreement with FEMA, a community does not need to have a separate agreement. The signed information agreement in place allows for personally identifiable information or PII data from the state to be shared with the community. Because the state is curating and providing the data to a community, only the state needs to have a signed agreement with FEMA to access NFIP PII data. To request NFIP PII, please contact your state hazard mitigation officer or state NFIP coordinator to initiate an agreement for your state. Tribal, nation, or territory, please contact your FEMA Regional Flood Insurance Liaison. Next, I'm going to turn it to Shandy. She will provide information about the flood mitigation assistance with current program details.
Thank you so much, Christian. In this section, we will discuss the funding available, key dates, eligible activities, and other program details applicants and sub-applicants need to know in order to submit their sub-applications and sub-applications. First, we'd like to cover important dates. Application deadlines vary. An eligible state, tribe, or territory must have received a flood-related emergency or major disaster declaration between June 1st, 2025 and May 31st, 2027. For each qualifying event, FEMA will provide application deadlines, funding set-asides, and pertinent grant opportunity information to applicants. All applications must be received by the FEMA given deadline. If you experience technical issues outside of your control, you must notify FEMA as soon as possible and before your application deadline. Failure to notify FEMA promptly may prevent your application from being considered. Please be aware that no new system-related issues will be addressed after the applicant's application deadline. The following two slides provide an overview of how the fiscal year 2026 Swift Current funding works for initial and subsequent activations. To qualify, an applicant must have a major or emergency flood-related disaster declaration between June 1st, 2025 and May 31st, 2027. In addition, at least one of the following must be true. The applicant has at least $1 million in NFIP flood insurance claims in the 12 months before the disaster declaration incident period start date. The applicant has 500 or more NFIP flood insurance claims resulting from the declared flood-related disaster event, or the applicant is a U.S. territory or federally recognized tribal government applying directly to FEMA for disaster assistance, and there is at least one paid NFIP flood insurance claim in the 12 months before the incident period start date, or there is at least one NFIP defined or FMA defined severe repetitive loss or repetitive loss property. Applicants are not expected to track these thresholds themselves. FEMA monitors the disaster activity and NFIP claims to determine eligibility for Swift Current activation. Eligible applicants can receive up to $40 million in set-aside funding and will be given either a 120 or 150-day application period to apply. The full legal criteria and the definitions are in the fiscal year 2026 Swift Current Notice of Funding Opportunity. After an initial Swift Current activation, new flood-related disasters may qualify an applicant for additional Swift Current funding. FEMA again uses NFIP claim thresholds and declaration dates to decide if a subsequent activation occurs. Subsequent activations can provide up to $30 million in additional Swift Current set-aside funding. Eligible applicants will be notified and given a 120 or 150-day application window. To be considered for a subsequent activation, the applicant must receive another major or emergency flood-related disaster declaration between the immediate previous Swift Current activation and the disaster declaration deadline of May 31st, 2027. FEMA then again looks at NFIP flood insurance claims from that subsequent event. At least one of the following thresholds must be met for subsequent activation. At least $1 million in prior NFIP flood insurance claims between the previous activation's disaster declaration date and the incident period start date of the subsequent declaration, or 500 or more NFIP flood insurance claims in the subsequent declared disaster. For federally recognized tribes and U.S. territories, at least one paid NFIP claim between the previous activation and the new declaration date, or at least one NFIP defined or FMA defined severe repetitive loss or repetitive loss structure. Based on which threshold is met, FEMA may provide additional Swift Current set-aside funding up to $30 million per applicant, with application windows of 120 or 150 days. As with initial activations, applicants do not need to track these claims threshold. FEMA will notify applicants if a subsequent activation is available and will provide the exact maximum set-aside funding and the open and close application dates. The detailed table of determination descriptions, maximum set-asides, and application open periods is provided in the program's supporting materials and in the fiscal year 2026 Swift Current Notice of Funding Opportunity. For Swift Current, the main eligible project type is individual flood mitigation projects. Focusing funding on individual flood mitigation projects in a post-disaster environment allows us to align Swift Current with the flood insurance claims process. This provides a real opportunity to speed up the timeline for selection and obligation of individual awards to positively impact disaster survivors, to reduce disaster suffering, and support resilience. As previously mentioned, speed is a key pillar of Swift Current. With that in mind, Swift Current homes in on individual flood mitigation projects such as elevations, acquisitions, and mitigation reconstruction. Within individual flood mitigation projects, the eligible buildings include flood mitigation assistance and NFIP-defined severe repetitive loss and repetitive loss structures, as well as NFIP-insured structures deemed substantially damaged in the event. All structures included in Swift Current projects must be NFIP insured. Here is a visual representation of the most common Swift Current project types. On the left are the disaster-impacted structures. The first home lost its second story and one of the exterior walls. The middle house is flooded and partially sits in what appears to be a low-lying area where water pools. The third house is completely engulfed in floodwaters. On the right, we show what post-disaster mitigation might look like for the mitigation reconstruction, elevation, and acquisition and demolition project types. Swift Current has the power to mitigate flood risks for communities that suffer severe flooding. This serves as one example of how this funding opportunity can build community resilience against the next flooding event. Individual flood mitigation projects offer several federal cost share options. For properties defined by flood mitigation assistance as severe repetitive loss, up to 100% federal cost share funding is available. For properties classified as flood mitigation assistance repetitive loss, the federal cost share can be up to 90%. If neither of these higher cost shares applies, projects may receive up to 75% federal cost share funding. Here, we've prepared a checklist of potential steps a policyholder, local government official, or state, tribe, or territory may take to prepare for a potential Swift Current activation under the fiscal year 2026 Swift Current Notice of Funding Opportunity. These lists are not all-inclusive, but are a good start in preparing to apply for a Swift Current grant. The policyholder column includes steps such as confirming NFIP coverage and contacting local or tribal governments to confirm application deadlines. Local government officials may conduct outreach with NFIP-insured property owners in their community and identify eligible severe repetitive loss, and substantially damaged properties within their community. Consider getting an information sharing agreement in place prior to the activation to make this process more seamless. On the applicant level, again, ensure that a data sharing agreement is in place and confirm access to the FEMA GO system. If your state, tribe, or territory is activated for Swift Current, this slide shows the typical process flow of what to expect. In this graphic, we try to break down everything into simplified major parts of the Swift Current process. Major steps 1 through 3 link to the activation eligibility. This starts with the potential applicant meeting declared disaster and NFIP claims-based criteria. FEMA headquarters will monitor disaster activity and flood insurance claims activity. Once a potential applicant meets the criteria, FEMA headquarters will notify the FEMA region of the applicant's eligibility along with the application deadlines and funding maximum set-aside amount. The FEMA region will then notify the applicant of SWIFT current eligibility. In steps 4 and 5, the applicant then has 120 or 150 days to submit applications and sub-applications. Step 6 is the standard 36-month period of performance for work to be completed and ultimately resulting in mitigated homes and buildings for NFIP policyholders. Now, in the next couple of slides, we've developed some high-level points about management cost and an example of raw calculations. At a high level, an applicant's management cost is up to 10% of the aggregate of all total sub-application budgets and is inclusive of the SWIFT current maximum set-aside amount. Management costs for SWIFT current does require a non-federal cost share. Management costs may be tricky to calculate, and this example hopefully will help. This scenario is for a SWIFT current activation with a $10 million funding set aside. We'll head to the next slide to see how management costs would be applied to this scenario. In this example, 3 sub-applicants have submitted projects to the applicant. Each sub-applicant's federal cost share is indicated with the total project cost in the first column. In the second column, the applicant does a calculation to determine the total requested recipient management cost. In the third column, the total federal cost share for all of the sub-applicants is calculated as a percent. In the fourth column, the aggregate non-federal cost share for all sub-applications is also calculated as a percent. From there, the eligible applicant management cost can then be calculated, as shown in the final 2 columns of the table. I'll now turn it over to Jeanette, and she will cover some SWIFT current project examples.
Thank you so much, Shandy. Next, we'll provide some SWIFT current success stories from Louisiana and Iowa. The fiscal year 2022 Flood Mitigation Assistance SWIFT Current Initiative provided $40 million to Louisiana to accelerate mitigation projects for NFIP-insured, repetitively flooded properties. One of those projects funded the elevation of 5 homes in New Orleans that had experienced 21 flood insurance claims, totaling nearly $500,000 in damages. Elevating these homes significantly reduces future flood risk and preserves housing stability for residents. LeClaire, Iowa is a river town along the Mississippi River. LeClaire worked with the Iowa Homeland Security and Emergency Management to pursue the Federal Emergency Management Agency's Flood Mitigation Assistance SWIFT Current funding to buy a home with a history of repetitive flood losses, with the goal of removing it to mitigate future risk from flooding. This project is a win for everyone involved. It eliminated the homeowner's future repair costs and flood claims against the property, which will cut down on the need for government help during floods. Now, the property, once designated as a repetitive loss to the National Flood Insurance Program, has been turned into open space, and no new buildings can be put up in this high-risk area. This was the first fiscal year 2023 project completed under SWIFT Current and resulted in a natural buffer to future flooding. LeClaire provided 25% of the total project cost. The acquisition project's federal share was $174,375, and the project took 10 months to complete. Mitigation efforts such as property acquisition provide the following benefits. First, they save money. They eliminate future flood claims and save homeowners from future flooding expenses. Next, they prevent flood damage. They allow floodplains to function naturally and reduce risk of harm to the homeowners. Lastly, they support disaster survivors. They make communities more resilient, allowing them to use disaster resources in other areas. As we move into the next section, we'll focus on application best practices and minimum eligibility requirements for FMA. These slides are designed to help applicants and sub-applicants avoid common pitfalls and ensure their submissions meet program standards. We'll cover what FEMA looks for in a complete and eligible application, including key documentation, scope of work, and alignment with program priorities. By following these best practices and understanding eligibility criteria, you can maximize your chances of success. As you're working on your sub-application, it's important to double check that it meets all eligibility requirements. These are some of the most common reasons sub-applications are found ineligible during eligibility and completeness reviews. Taking the time to ensure your sub-application is complete and aligns with these requirements will help your project move forward smoothly. The NOFO and the HMA policy guide are great resources to help guide you to meet each of these requirements. First, does the applicant and sub-applicant have an approved mitigation plan at the time the application period closes? Applicants and sub-applicants must have a FEMA-approved hazard mitigation plan in place by the application deadline. If the plan is missing or expired, the sub-application is automatically ineligible. Are all applicants participating in the NFIP and not withdrawn, on probation, or suspended? All applicants must be participating in the NFIP and not be withdrawn, on probation, or suspended. Structures eligible for individual flood mitigation projects under Swift Current must have an active NFIP policy, including a group flood insurance policy, in effect prior to the opening of the application period. The policy must be maintained throughout the life of the structure and must meet the FMA or NFIP definition of a severe repetitive loss or repetitive loss property, or be NFIP insured and deemed substantially damaged after the incident period start date of the disaster declaration. Is the activity eligible in the program? The proposed activity must be eligible under flood mitigation assistance as defined in the NOFO and program guidance. Is the applicant sub-applicant eligible? Only eligible entities can apply. We covered this earlier in the presentation. Lastly, is there confirmation that the project does not duplicate other federally funded programs? The project cannot duplicate funding or activities already covered by other federal programs. If there's duplication, the sub-application will be found ineligible. When checking for completeness, check to see the following. Is the scope of work complete and well described? The scope of work must be clear, detailed, and be aligned with the project's goals, schedule, and budget. Incomplete or vague descriptions are a common reason for an application to be deemed ineligible. Was a detailed budget submitted? A comprehensive, itemized budget must be included. Lump sum budgets or missing budget details are not accepted and will result in an application being deemed ineligible. If your project requires a benefit cost analysis or BCA, did you submit a complete BCA demonstrating cost effectiveness? For projects that require a BCA, the analysis must be included and demonstrate cost effectiveness. Missing or incomplete BCAs are a frequent reason for denial. FMA benefit cost analysis must utilize a 7% discount rate when calculating the present value of future benefits and costs for mitigation projects. FEMA also offers a benefit cost analysis toolkit on FEMA.gov to assist sub-applicants. Lastly, is the project under $1 million? If the project is under $1 million, you must submit a narrative that includes qualitative and quantitative data demonstrating the benefits and cost effectiveness of the project. We will frequently encounter issues with flood mitigation assistance sub-applications, but there are several best practices that can help address these challenges. One key takeaway is the importance of submitting complete and well-organized documentation. Missing or unclear attachments often lead to ineligibility, so it's recommended to use clear, acronym-free titles that accurately reflect your project activities. When preparing your budget, remember to include costs for environmental compliance or permitting as needed. For environmental and historic preservation, or EHP, compliance review, be sure to provide accurate GPS coordinates, correspondence or permits from regulatory agencies, construction dates for impacted structures and outbuildings, correspondence with state or tribal historic preservation officers, maps, photos, design drawings, and other relevant materials. The EHP checklist in the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Policy Guide, or FEMA GO, can help ensure your sub-application is as complete as possible. Another common mistake involves management costs. Make sure to request these in the correct place and at the right time, as additional funds cannot be added later. If you're uncertain about any requirements or how to categorize your project, reach out to your state hazard mitigation officer, tribal liaison, or FEMA regional office for guidance. Think of your application as telling a story. Every section, from the scope and budget to the schedule and supporting documents, should reinforce a consistent message and demonstrate that you've carefully considered all the details. Many issues with technical feasibility stem from unclear or missing information and documentation. It is also common for applications to lack a clear description of the level of protection or to fall short of meeting required design standards. When developing your sub-application, remember that technical feasibility is about proving your project is not just a good idea on paper, but that it's achievable, safe, and effective in practice. FEMA reviewers need to be confident that your project can be built as proposed, will function as intended, and will genuinely reduce risk. This requires your application to be internally consistent and supported by credible technical evidence. It's important to go beyond simply stating that your project will work. You need to show how and why, using recognized standards and clear documentation. This approach helps FEMA quickly verify your project's readiness and effectiveness. Ultimately, demonstrating strong technical feasibility makes your project more competitive and increases the likelihood that it will move forward smoothly if selected for funding. One common pitfall for sub-applicants has to do with documenting cost effectiveness. FEMA needs to see that the benefits of your project clearly outweigh the costs. The benefit cost analysis, or BCA, is how you demonstrate this. A strong BCA is more than just running the numbers. It's about providing clear, well-supported evidence for every input and assumption. For example, missing building-specific information like type, use, or lowest floor elevation, or unclear data about the population served by utilities can make it difficult for reviewers to validate your project's benefits. One of the most common pitfalls we see is submitting an inconsistent or incomplete BCA documentation. This includes cases where multiple BCAs are submitted, the benefit cost ratio in the sub-application doesn't match the attachments, or the analysis can't be recreated with the provided documentation. Reviewers need to be able to follow your calculations and understand your data sources. It is also essential to use the correct BCA tools and modules. Using the wrong approach or applying pre-calculated benefits when they don't fit the project can result in the application being deemed ineligible. Other frequent issues can involve using unclear or unsupported information as the basis for estimated damage when calculating and presenting BCA information, or when scenario events aren't justified with solid information. Make sure your supporting documentation matches your analysis and use justification boxes in the BCA toolkit whenever possible. On many occasions, the cost-effectiveness narrative for projects under 1 million does not have enough information to develop a benefit cost ratio. Following FEMA's instructions, submit a complete narrative that includes qualitative and quantitative data demonstrating the benefits and cost effectiveness of the project. Next, I am going to pass it over to Jessica, who will speak about environmental planning and historic preservation.
Thanks, Jeanette. All projects receiving federal funding must be compliant with environmental and historic preservation laws. A common pitfall we see is neglecting or postponing the incorporation of EHP into the development of the sub-application. A best practice is to identify impacts to natural and cultural resources early in the project planning, including any permits or resource surveys, and then incorporating them into the project's scope, budget, and timeline. This can really streamline your review and avoid delays. It is understood that each sub-application will be different based on the complexity or stage of development, but a complete sub-application includes as much EHP documentation as is available. In addition to the requirements discussed earlier, including details such as site descriptions, location of equipment and material staging areas, information about proposed ground disturbing activities like utility relocation or foundation removal, and any correspondence with a state or federal resource or regulatory agency like the State Historic Preservation Office, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, are all important and can improve review timelines. As the adage goes, a picture is worth 1,000 words, so include photos, design drawings, and maps. Upload any environmental documentation and clearly reference them in your sub-application. Including these is essential for EHP compliance review and can reduce the number of requests for information. Remember, the EHP checklist should be used as a tool to develop and submit the most complete sub-application possible. Additional EHP resources are available via various technical job aids on FEMA.gov using environmental as the keyword search. For compliance troubleshooting, please don't hesitate to use the EHP resources in this presentation or the NOFO. And now I'll pass it to Katya, who will speak about how to apply in FEMA GO.
Thank you, Jessica. Next, we'll talk about applying to this program in the FEMA Grants Outcome System, also known as FEMA GO, and the important deadlines. Alrighty, so how to apply. Eligible applicants must apply for funding using FEMA GO at the FEMA GO portal. Technical user manuals and support materials are available on the FEMA GO site for hazard mitigation assistance grants. FEMA will provide the application deadline information to all eligible applicants. Any system-related issues must be submitted by 3:00 p.m. Eastern Time on the date applications are due and will be addressed by FEMA. All applications must be received in FEMA GO before the application period deadline. If you are a first-time FEMA GO user, start by determining whether you are applying as an applicant or a sub-applicant. Now, if you're applying as a sub-applicant, connect with the organization that will be submitting the grant application, such as your state, tribal, or territorial government. Next, confirm that your SAM.gov account and Unique Entity Identifier, or UEI, are active. Set up a login.gov account using your work email. You'll also need to connect with the eBiz POC listed on your SAM.gov account to add an authorized organization representative, or AOR, to your team. For additional information and troubleshooting, refer to the FEMA GO Startup Guide. Now, if you are a returning FEMA GO user, you want to make sure your SAM.gov account and UEI are active and renewed annually. As an AOR, review your team members, update roles, and remove anybody who is no longer with your organization. It's important to have at least one AOR on the team, and having redundancy is helpful in case an AOR leaves. Ensure all your team members can log in successfully. And for more details, consult the FEMA GO Startup Guide. So the authorized organizational representative, or AOR, must create the grant application before any sub-applications can be created. Once the AOR signs the grant assurances and certifications, an application ID is generated. At that time, sub-applications can then be linked to the grant and submitted for review. The AOR reviews each sub-application and submits them to FEMA individually. The submission status changes from pending once the first sub-application is submitted. So the Sub-Organization Authorized Representative, or SAR, is responsible for creating the sub-application and linking it to the parent organization through which it will be submitted. It's important to note that once the sub-application is submitted to FEMA, you cannot change the title or sub-application type. Management cost applications are reserved for grant-level applicants only, while all sub-applications have a subrecipient management cost built into the budget section. Each section of the sub-application allows for document uploads to support your submission. For additional guidance, refer to the FEMA GO Pass-Through Application and Startup Guide. Okay, these screenshots show where to find and enter your subrecipient management costs in FEMA GO. Swift Current subrecipient management costs do not share the 100% cost share found in other hazard mitigation assistance grant programs. The maximum cost share on management costs for Swift Current subawards matches that of the overall project. For example, if the subapplicant has a federal cost share of 90%, then the subrecipient management cost share can be up to 90%. SRMC can be up to 5% of your total sub-application budget. Be sure to clearly label and justify each item. Now remember, your subrecipient management costs must be included at the time of submission. You cannot add them on later, so double check your budget before submitting. To add your subrecipient management costs in FEMA GO, you must first enter at least one other cost type, such as construction or equipment cost estimates, before the option to add management cost becomes available. And once you've entered your initial cost estimate, you can scroll back up to the top of the budget section and click the blue Add Cost Type button. Then you'll see management cost as an option in the drop-down menu. So once you've selected management cost as a cost type, you will need to add specific line items that describe how you plan to use these funds. Here's an important note. Remember, subrecipient management cost share must not exceed the federal cost share applied to the overall project. For example, if the federal share is 90%, then the subrecipient management cost federal share can be up to 90%. This is important to mention because Swift Current subrecipient management costs do not share the 100% cost share found in other hazard mitigation assistance grant programs. Okay, so once you've selected management cost as a cost type, you'll need to add specific line items that describe how you plan to use the funds. Common examples include equipment, office space rentals, salaries, supplies, or even travel. And remember, each item you add should directly relate to managing and administering your Swift Current subaward. The cost must be reasonable and necessary. If you need to add more than one type of management cost, you can do so by selecting additional items from the drop-down menu. Double check that your total subrecipient management cost request does not exceed 5% of your total sub-application budget, and that all items are clearly labeled and justified. And just a reminder, the federal cost share on management costs for Swift Current subawards matches that of the overall project. So make sure it's not funded at 100% before you move to the next section. And now I will pass it off to Jessica to talk about environmental and historic preservation questions.
Thanks, Katya. The EHP review information section with questions A through J is intended to walk sub-applicants through questions in the sub-application that are necessary to complete the EHP compliance review. The questions in FEMA GO are modeled after the EHP checklist found in the HMA policy guide. You'll select yes, no, or not known for each required question and provide written responses as requested. FEMA staff reviews and validates this information and may request additional information if not answered completely. So, the more completely and accurately these questions are answered, the less likely FEMA will need to request additional project information and can begin the compliance review. And now I will pass it back to FMA's branch chief, Brandon, to speak to important resources.
Thanks so much, Jessica. Next, I'll share information about program resources that may be useful as you learn more about Swift Current and start to build your application. So some of these key resources for the fiscal year 26 Swift Current opportunity are available on FEMA.gov's Flood Mitigation Assistance Swift Current page. And there you can go find program details and application guidance. The Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program and Policy Guide provides overall requirements of HMA programs, which include flood mitigation assistance. As mentioned, the National Flood Insurance Program Community Status Book provides community participation status and can be used to determine if your community is eligible for flood mitigation assistance funding. For useful contacts, please refer to the provided directories for the State Floodplain Managers List, State Hazard Mitigation Officers, and FEMA regional offices. Sub-applicants are encouraged to reach out to their state hazard mitigation officers as the primary point of contact for questions and assistance. Additional resources are also provided here for substantial damage determinations and a desk reference and estimator tool for determining substantial damage. Information also includes navigating property elevation and acquisition project types and environmental review information details. Lastly, resources are provided for benefit cost analysis with a provided toolkit, which includes guidance for preparing analysis for repetitive loss projects and applicable pre-calculated benefits. All resources provided are located on FEMA.gov. Applicants should coordinate through FEMA regional office point of contacts, and sub-applicants should maintain contact with their state hazard mitigation officers. FEMA helplines are available to support applicants and sub-applicants with application system issues, program questions, benefit cost analysis, building science guidance, and other compliance requirements. Additional helplines included for FEMA GO system support, benefit cost analysis, environmental and historic preservation questions, and building science publication questions. Next, I'll turn it over to John to lead us through question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brandon. And as we enter this phase of the webinar, question and answers, I want to remind you to continue to use that Q&A pod at the bottom of your screen to submit any additional questions you may have. Lots of you have been using it already. That's awesome. And our team is eager to continue to address your questions. So please feel free to reach out using that feature on the Zoom screen. So Brandon, I'm going to ask for your help. I've got lots of questions that have come in. Let's start. Hazard mitigation plan. Applicant is asking, attendee is asking, are we required to have a hazard mitigation plan to apply?
Yeah, no, this is a great question. So all applicants must have a FEMA-approved state or tribal mitigation plan. This can include a standard or an enhanced plan, and they must have it by the application deadline and at the time of obligation of the award. All sub-applicants, so these are communities applying to applicants, are required to have a FEMA-approved local or tribal hazard mitigation plan by the application deadline and at the time of obligation of grant funds. More information about the status of FEMA-approved hazard mitigation plans can be found on FEMA's Hazard Mitigation Planning website, which we have a link provided.
Thank you for that, Brandon. Now, for sub-applications, how will sub-applications be reviewed and ranked and prioritized for funding? And who will perform these tasks?
Yeah, so applicants can submit sub-applications up to their maximum funding set aside by their specific individual application deadline that's provided by FEMA. Once submitted, sub-applications are reviewed and awarded on a rolling basis. So we'll just continually be reviewing and awarding projects as they come in. So please don't, hold up submissions once they're complete. We'll just keep the awards rolling as they go.
Great, important information. Thank you. Next is about the information agreement. So what is the state, tribe, and territory information agreement for NFIP data with communities?
So FEMA's state, tribe, and territory information agreement expands and expedites data sharing between these government entities and their partners. Once the information agreement is signed, a community doesn't need to sign an additional agreement with FEMA to receive National Flood Insurance Program personally identifiable information. Data from the state. Since the state, tribe, or territory is curating and providing the data to the community, they are the entity that needs to have a signed agreement with FEMA to access this specific data. This type of data includes flood insurance policy information, rep loss status, which is required for eligibility into the program, severe repetitive loss, and repetitive loss information.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for explaining that. Continuing on with NFIP, question: if the homeowner's NFIP policy has lapsed between the disaster declaration and the application open period for the Swift Current activation, what will the NFIP requirements be if they would like to apply?
Yeah, so structures are eligible for individual flood mitigation projects. They have to have a current National Flood Insurance Program policy. This includes group flood insurance policies as well, and it must be in effect prior to the opening of the application period, and the policy must be maintained throughout the project and the life of the structure. The requirement of maintaining flood insurance will apply during the life of the property, regardless of transfer of ownership of such property. And just to really reiterate, this is a national flood insurance program policy. It can't be a private policy. It has to be one written through the NFIP.
All right, thank you. Important NFIP policy concerns, insurance policy concerns. How about building codes, Brandon? Can you clarify the requirement for building codes?
Yeah, absolutely. So for all activities where there's a mitigated structure remaining after completion, we're talking about things like elevation, mitigation, reconstruction, floodproofing, etc. They have to be designed in accordance with the National Flood Insurance Program standards in Title 44, Code of Federal Regulations, Part 60. And this establishes criteria for land management and use of the most recent edition of the American Society of Civil Engineers, ASCE 24 Flood Design and Construction Standard. And this provides the minimum design criteria. The current edition of ASCE 24 was published this past January 2025.
Great, thank you for that important information. This next question is on the increased federal cost share. So, do FMA's individual flood mitigation project increased federal cost share percentage options of up to 100, 0, and 90, 10? Do they only apply to severe repetitive loss and repetitive loss?
Yeah, this is a great question. So, for FMA, the individual flood mitigation project types have an enhanced federal cost share. And so there's multiple definitions of policies. There's an NFIP definition that can be used, and it's eligible for flood mitigation assistance. But the enhanced cost share is only available to those policies that fall under the FMA definition of repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss. So, up to 100% federal cost share is available for FMA defined severe repetitive loss policies. And there's two definitions. One is under BI or BII, and that's defined under 42 U.S. Code Section 4104C H3. That we are able to offer up to 90% federal cost share funding for flood mitigation assistance defined repetitive loss properties, and that's provided in 42 U.S. United States Code Section 4121A7. For all other projects, substantial damage, NFIP defined rep loss, severe rep loss, we can provide up to 75% federal cost share funding if a higher cost share is available.
Got it. Important distinctions there with the federal cost share. Brandon, we have a flag in the comments questions to note that if you are applying as a local government, make sure you find out the applicant's internal due date. It may not be the same due date as FEMA's date and may be several weeks before FEMA's due date. Would you care to comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Swift Current works in a disaster environment, so it is different than our annual opportunity, which many people are familiar with because it's been around for a long time. So for Swift Current, the application deadlines vary. An eligible state, tribe, or territory must have received a flood-related emergency or major disaster declaration between June 1st, 2025 and May 31st, 2027. And for each qualifying event, FEMA is going to provide a deadline to the applicant. All applications must be received by the FEMA given deadline. However, for sub-applicants, we want to reiterate that if you are a sub-applicant, that you need to check with your applicant. If you're applying to a state, you need to check with them and or any published resources to ensure that you're meeting all of their application deadlines, because as a sub-applicant, you are submitting your application to the applicant, who is then maybe going through their own priorities and has an earlier deadline for sub-applications due, and it is going to take that package and submit it up to FEMA. So really working closely with the applicant, in your cases, in many cases, it's going to be the state, to ensure that you're preparing sub-applications in line with the priorities, as well as meeting any of the state's deadlines that they have.
Oh, that's very good, Brandon. Important points regarding deadlines. I'd like to ask about management costs. We have a question. How much recipient management costs and subrecipient management costs are we eligible for through the Swift Current grant program?
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is just very, this is the same as our FMA annual program as well, but applicants and sub-applicants are eligible to request, for applicants up to 10% and for sub-applicants up to 5% respectively of the total cost of the federal share. And so it is a cost share that is provided. It's not a 100% management costs like you may see with like the hazard mitigation grant program or the building resilient infrastructure program. And management costs are defined for FMA in accordance with 44 Code of Federal Regulations section 77.7A1, and that provides the allowable cost for flood mitigation grants. Management costs, as I mentioned, are subject to a federal and a non-federal cost match. Again, they're not 100%. Applicants will submit a single sub-application for management costs, and sub-applicants will submit management costs as a request as a line item in their existing sub-application, so they don't have to submit a separate management cost sub-application. If you are a sub-applicant, only applicants have to submit a separate sub-application for their management costs.
Important emphasis there on the management costs. Thank you. An attendee asks, in my state, we have had recent declared flood disasters and have multiple priority projects. Should we apply to FMA or the FMA Swift Current funding opportunity for severe repetitive loss or repetitive loss properties?
So yeah, the Swift Current opportunity is only available if an applicant receives an emergency or a major disaster declaration for a flood-related disaster event and meets, very specific activation criteria as stated in the funding opportunity. And, our program lead Shandy Telshek went over in this presentation. So whereas the annual flood mitigation assistance funding opportunity is a competitive grant opportunity with no activation criteria, um, both the annual program and Swift Current do fund individual flood mitigation projects, including, prioritizing under the annual program and as an eligibility factor under Swift Current for severe repetitive loss structures and repetitive loss structures that are insured under the National Flood Insurance Program. So applicants, are really encouraged to reach out to their FEMA regional office to confirm their eligibility for any mitigation funding opportunities that may be available. Sub-applicants are encouraged to reach out to their state hazard mitigation officers or tribal liaisons to understand more about what, if a Swift Current opportunity is available, or if they should be more focused on the FEMA annual, the FMA annual program, or other grant opportunities that are available to leverage for flood mitigation funding.
Thanks, Brandon. On eligibility, and I think this may have been answered, but can you clarify again, how will the state or community know if it's eligible for Swift Current?
Yeah, absolutely. So FEMA is going to identify and notify applicants of eligibility to apply for Swift Current based on qualifying disaster events. One requirement is that that applicant have an emergency or a major disaster declaration, and it must be issued for a flood event. There's certain also additional qualifying criteria, around the number of claims are received from that event and also the historic NFIP claim payments that have been made for that. So FEMA will, again, notify the state of a Swift Current activation and also provide that important, the set aside that's available as well as the application deadlines that activation will be subject to.
Oh, thanks for making that very clear, Brandon. About funding, the question here is funding seems to vary based on different situations. How will I know how much funding is available for my state?
So again, like FEMA is going to identify and notify applicants of eligibility to apply for Swift Current based on the qualifying disaster events. So based on the criteria of the funding opportunity, FEMA is going to provide the maximum funding set aside and application deadline for each activated applicant. So they'll know exactly how much funding is available as a maximum set aside. And then also, what are those pertinent deadlines to get applications in. Again, for a state, for sub-applicants, developing and submitting and getting those applications cleared as soon as possible is really important because FEMA will be reviewing and awarding projects on a rolling basis. So we aren't just gonna, we hope that folks aren't expecting to just stay and wait till the end of the application deadline. They should be submitting them as they're going so that we can get mitigation funding out there quickly as we are working, to mitigate disaster survivors of an event.
Thank you, Brandon. Important reminder on eligibility and funding. Back to repetitive loss. This question is, will FEMA check if a property submitted for Swift Current is repetitive loss or severe repetitive loss?
Yeah, no, this is a great question. So, the team works very closely with the NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Program side of the house. And so because we have a lot of that flood insurance information, we're able to provide that analysis. So during FEMA's project review, we're going to confirm the property's repetitive loss status, severe repetitive loss status, and the National Flood Insurance Program flood policy coverage. And we can actually, we'll be able to validate and provide that information.
Got it. Thank you for that. And from a state perspective, if my state is activated for Swift Current, is the funding available for properties across the whole state or just in the declared disaster areas?
So, buildings included in an individual flood mitigation project sub-application have to meet the flood mitigation assistance or National Flood Insurance Program definitions for severe um, repetitive loss or substantially damaged properties after the applicant's incident period start date. So, applicants can choose to prioritize buildings located in the specific disaster declared areas. They really should look again, like Swift Current is built so that we are mitigating flood disaster survivors after an event. So those properties should be prioritized and be working to get mitigation in there as soon as they're starting those repairs and so forth. So they can quickly not only get their structure repaired, but also mitigated so that they're kind of breaking that cycle of repair and recovery.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally agree. Many great questions so far. This is fantastic. Can you tell us the main differences between Swift Current and the annual flood mitigation assistance grant?
Yeah, absolutely. So Swift Current focuses on streamlining funding for individual flood mitigation projects after an emergency or a major flood related disaster declaration. So Swift Current funding is used to mitigate and reduce the risk of flood damage to buildings insured under the NFIP after a flood related emergency major disaster declaration. So, eligible activities are very limited, are included individual flood mitigation projects for buildings that meet those definitions. They meet the repetitive loss, severe repetitive loss, or substantial damage definitions. And this is, again, after an applicant's disaster incident period start date. So it really is providing in-time funding to mitigate disaster survivors that have an NFIP policy, and as a further piece, also have a history, right, of repetitive flood losses or are substantially damaged. Greater than 50% of the value of the structure has been damaged in that event. So in comparison, though, the annual flood mitigation assistance grant is a nationally competitive, sort of blue sky funding opportunity with a broader range of. It's not only held every year as a competitive opportunity, but it also funds a broader range of flood mitigation activities and projects that don't have that disaster declaration criteria. And so the annual FMA grant focuses on reducing and eliminating, rep loss, flood damage to buildings and structures insured under the NFIP, and then also within participating communities. But there are multiple categories of eligible activities, such as capacity and capability building activities, which include things like technical assistance, project scoping, those sorts of activities to get communities funding to be able to have a more robust flood mitigation assistance program. It also includes localized flood risk reduction projects, which are those larger projects that impact multiple areas of, that include policyholders, uh, bioswales, larger flood restoration type activities. And then we also have the individual flood mitigation projects, which are the elevation, acquisition, mitigation, reconstruction type projects in there. One thing to note is that project scoping, project scoping, as I mentioned, is available under the annual program.
Yes, yes. Brandon, thanks for taking the time to explain all of that and giving those important examples. Just again, reiterate on project scoping. Question here, can my state apply for project scoping under Swift Current?
Yeah, so for fiscal year 2026, project scoping is not an eligible activity type, and so it's not being offered under this iteration of Swift Current. You may have seen it in the previous iteration, and so just wanted to be really clear that project scoping, because of the disaster focus of Swift Current, if you are looking for that funding, it's really good to look at the annual program for it. And project scoping, helps pay for things like engineering, scoping out projects that could be submitted for flood mitigation assistance. And so for those activities, really look to the annual program. But for Swift Current, focus is just on, starting this year, we'll focus just on the individual flood mitigation project types of acquisition, elevation, limited flood proofing, mitigation reconstruction, and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Following that, important, thanks for the important notes there. Turning to, if we could, pre-calculated benefits. Here's the question. Can sub-applications for individual property mitigation projects contain a mix of pre-calculated benefit properties and substantially damaged waiver properties? Or do those two types of cost effectiveness calculations have to be kept separate into two sub-applications?
Yeah, no, so this is a great question. So, applications are made up of multiple properties. And so, yes, sub-applications may include multiple properties that use different approaches for demonstrating cost effectiveness. So some applications use a hybrid approach. The sub-applicant chooses a subset of properties to which they apply pre-calculated benefits. They fit under those pre-calculated benefits for acquisition, elevation, mitigation, reconstruction. And then other properties within that sub-application may then may not have pre-calculated benefits available. And so then they have to demonstrate cost effectiveness by being located, in a riverine special flood hazard area, SFHA, and include a certification from the local floodplain administrator or certified state tribal floodplain specialist that identifies and declares each structure as substantially damaged. They also have a waiver for benefit cost analysis. So any remaining properties not using those above mentioned methodologies, the sub-applicant would then analyze the remaining properties using the BCA toolkit or other FEMA approved methodology, and the project costs and benefits for this subset would be aggregated to develop a composite BCA. And so that benefit cost or ratio that comes out of all of those properties within the project would have to be 1.0 or greater for it to be considered to still be eligible.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. That's important question and answer about different types of properties and aggregating the benefits. Thank you, Brandon. Next question is about additional help. It seems like folks want to know: is there technical assistance available for applicants and sub-applicants?
Yeah, so this is, definitely one of the big things that we've offered under Swift Current that's been very successful. And so we offer what we call tailored pre-application support to applicants as well as sub-applicants applying for this funding opportunity. Support may include FEMA GO system support, benefit cost analysis support, project cost estimates, and environmental and historic preservation assistance. So applicants can request support through the regional office or the regional tribal liaisons at FEMA. And then sub-applicants can request this reports through the state hazard mitigation officer or tribal liaisons. And so definitely don't be afraid to ask, developing mitigation projects within the disaster environment, and especially navigating the intricacies of the NFIP policy requirements, the repetitive loss, severe repetitive loss, eligibility requirements that we have. Those are all things that we want to support our state and local and tribal applicants and sub-applicants. And so don't be afraid to ask, and we'll definitely, have that built into our program.
Thank you. I totally agree there. Wow, we're making great progress, and we probably have a time for another question, Brandon. Can a sub-applicant have SRL, RL, and substantially damaged structures together in the same application for the same mitigation activity?
Yes, absolutely. So if you have an elevation project and it's got a spattering of NFIP, severe repetitive loss, FMA defined repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss structures, and even some structures that have been determined by the local jurisdiction, the floodplain administrator, as being substantially damaged, those can all be, included in the same sub application.
Okay. Well, this has been really worthwhile, and we got through a lot of important questions. The attendees have been paying attention, asking great questions. We've also answered many of them in the Q&A. But at this time, again, want to thank our attendees for their participation. And remember this, if you have additional questions, feel free to contact your FEMA regional office. Now, at this point, as we approach the end, I'm happy to pass this now to Mr. Ryan Janda, Deputy Division Director of Hazard Mitigation Assistance, for our closing remarks today. Mr. Janda?
Thank you very much, John, and thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to the FEMA team and our partners who help support this fantastic webinar. Most importantly, thank you to our state, local, tribal, and territorial partners who are doing the work of mitigation every single day. Swift Current accelerates mitigation funding after disaster for NFIP-insured repetitive loss structures, helping eligible policyholders strengthen their homes sooner so they can avoid repeated financial losses and lessen the likelihood of prolonged displacement after future events. Ultimately, Swift Current helps communities recover smarter, build resilience faster, and break the cycle of repetitive flood loss. It better merges the flood disaster experience and our grant program opportunities. It's just a phenomenal funding opportunity. As you prepare your applications, I encourage you to focus on 3 things. First, start early. Make sure your SAM.gov registration, unique entity identifier, FEMA GO access, and required documentation are all in place. It's much better to do early than trying to do it towards the end of your application cycle. Second, be clear. A strong application should clearly explain the risk, the proposed solution, project readiness, and how the project will reduce future losses. As you're developing your application, please be mindful that the reviewers have never seen the application most likely before. Take us on a journey. Explain your application. Make sure it makes sense to somebody who's never looked at something before. Before you submit it, ask a colleague to take a look at it and see if it makes sense to them to make sure that you're not missing something. And third, stay connected. Work with your FEMA regional contacts, state hazard mitigation officers, tribal liaisons, and explore technical assistance resources online at FEMA.gov. Please note that resources will soon be available on our website, and additional support may be available from FEMA regional contacts and state hazard mitigation officers. FEMA's goal is not just to receive applications. Our goal is to support strong projects that lead to stronger outcomes for communities across the country. Thank you again for your time today, your partnership, and your commitment to reducing disaster risk. We look forward to seeing the projects you bring forward very soon. Before we close, we also ask that you complete the webinar survey. The link is available on the screen and through the Zoom platform, and your feedback helps us improve future deliveries. And before I go, just again want to say thank you to everybody involved in this process. Thank you to the FEMA team again. Just your efforts in all this have been outstanding. And again, thank you to all of our participants for attending today. Have a great day. Bye-bye.